At exactly 6:15 on that cold Monday morning in February, when Vicky Sterling blocked my path with both arms stretched wide like she was directing traffic at a major intersection, I knew my peaceful life at Willowbrook Estates had just come to an abrupt and dramatic end. In her perfectly manicured hand she clutched a violation notice that was thick as a master's thesis, while her eyes gleamed with the kind of predatory satisfaction you'd expect from someone who just struck gold in their own backyard. What I didn't expect at that moment, standing there in my wrinkled clothes and exhausted state 3 months later, this same woman would be handcuffed at this exact spot while the responding officers laughed like they were watching the best stand-up comedy show of their careers. But before we get to that absolutely satisfying moment of poetic justice, comment below where you're watching from, because I'm genuinely curious how far this incredible HOA drama has managed to spread across the internet. Trust me when I say you're going to want to stick around for this absolutely wild ride that nobody could have possibly made up. I just returned from what felt like the longest 10 days of my entire life, staying by my mother's bedside at Grady Memorial Hospital after she'd suffered a severe stroke that had completely changed our family's world in an instant. The last thing I expected upon returning to what I thought was the sanctuary of my own neighborhood was a welcoming committee, especially one that came armed with official paperwork and what appeared to be a professional photographer. Yes, you heard that absolutely correctly. Vicky had actually brought someone to document this early morning confrontation, like she was conducting some kind of serious criminal investigation rather than harassing a neighbor who just spent over a week watching his mother fight for her life in intensive care. The violation notice that she thrust aggressively through my car window with theatrical precision was for something called unauthorized extended absence without notification, which was apparently a brand new rule that had been passed with remarkable timing while I was literally holding my mother's hand in the ICU and praying she would survive her medical crisis. The timing of this new regulation wasn't coincidental in any way, as I would soon discover through my own investigation into Vicky Sterling's increasingly authoritarian methods of neighborhood control. Mr. Harrington, Vicky announced with the kind of manufactured authority that someone develops when they've appointed themselves the unofficial queen of suburban America, you have clearly and deliberately violated Section 12.44 of our newly updated and strictly enforced community standards. Extended absences of more than 7 consecutive days require written notification to the HOA board at least 48 hours in advance, and this requirement is non. She paused dramatically for maximum effect, clearly savoring every moment of this carefully orchestrated confrontation. Since you have completely failed to comply with these established procedures, you are now subject to immediate penalties and what we call enhanced monitoring of your future activities. The photographer continued, snapping away methodically while Vicky opened her expensive laptop right there on the public street, printing out additional documentation like she was operating some kind of mobile violation factory designed specifically for maximum intimidation. Here's the thing that made this entire ridiculous situation particularly ironic and almost comedic in its absurdity. I'm Elliot Harrington, and I make my living as a professional governance consultant for nonprofit organizations across the southeastern United States. I literally spend my days helping communities resolve complex disputes and fix their broken administrative systems for a living. I understand HOA law significantly better than most board members understand their own bylaws, and I've seen every trick in the book when it comes to petty authoritarians who abuse their limited power. But standing there at 6:15 in the morning, completely exhausted from 10 days of hospital visits and worried sick about my mother's uncertain recovery, I made what I thought was a conscious and mature decision to keep the peace rather than escalate an already tense situation. I was already dealing with enough overwhelming stress without adding a full-scale neighborhood war to my already overflowing plate of responsibilities. I completely understand your position, Mrs. Sterling, I replied as calmly as I could manage, accepting the official-looking violation notice without any argument or resistance. I was entirely focused on my mother's medical emergency and honestly didn't think to notify the board about my absence. I'll absolutely make sure to follow all proper procedures going forward to avoid any future misunderstandings. I genuinely thought this reasonable and diplomatic response would diffuse the obviously tense situation, but the cold smile that slowly spread across Vicky's face told me I had just made a significant tactical error in judgment. In her calculating mind, my polite compliance wasn't an act of good neighborly politeness, it was a clear sign of weakness, and submission and weakness, as I would very quickly learn through painful experience, was something that Vicky Sterling had spent years learning how to identify and ruthlessly exploit for her own benefit. As I slowly drove toward my house through the winding streets of our normally peaceful subdivision, I couldn't shake the increasingly uncomfortable feeling that this morning's encounter was far less about legitimate rule enforcement, and much more about establishing dominance and control over someone she perceived as a threat to her. Authority, the professional photographer, the elaborate mobile printing setup, the theatrical presentation of official documents. It all felt like carefully choreographed theater designed to intimidate and humiliate rather than actually address any genuine community concerns. But the most deeply unsettling part of the entire encounter was Vicky's chilling parting comment as I drove away toward my house. "This is just the beginning, Mr. Harrington." The way she said those words with that predatory smile and the unmistakable gleam of anticipation in her eyes made it crystal clear that my 10-day absence had somehow painted a bright red target squarely on my back. What I didn't know yet but would discover through careful investigation over the following weeks was that Vicky Sterling had spent those exact 10 days that I was at the hospital carefully orchestrating what she clearly saw as my inevitable downfall and removal from the community. She'd called multiple emergency board meetings during my absence, pushed through several new regulations specifically designed to target my situation, and methodically laid the groundwork for what she confidently believed would be a swift and decisive victory in her personal war against what she perceived as my challenge to her absolute authority. In her twisted mind, I was just another troublesome obstacle to be systematically removed from her perfectly controlled little kingdom where she ruled with an iron fist. But here's what Vicky Sterling didn't know about me and my background. While I might genuinely prefer peaceful and diplomatic solutions to conflicts, when someone pushes me into a corner and threatens everything I care about, I don't just push back with equal force. I completely and strategically changed the entire game to my advantage. Over the next 3 increasingly frustrating weeks, my poor mailbox became what I can only describe as Vicky's personal violation distribution center, operating with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine designed specifically for harassment. Every other day without fail brought a new elaborate infraction notice, each one more completely ridiculous and petty than the last, as if she was competing with herself to see how absurd she could make these alleged violations while still maintaining some thin veneer of official legitimacy. First came the infamous mailbox polish violation, where she claimed that our brass mailboxes required weekly polishing according to some obscure subsection of the community aesthetic standards, and mine had apparently gone 72 hours without proper maintenance, which she documented with time-stamped photographs taken from multiple angles. Then there was what she dramatically called the garage door incident, where I'd committed the heinous crime of leaving my garage door open for 31 minutes while I sorted through my mother's personal belongings to bring to her rehabilitation facility, which allegedly violated the 30-minute maximum open door policy that had been mysteriously implemented during my absence and applied retroactively to my situation. But the absolute crown jewel of complete absurdity was the lawnmower noise violation that demonstrated just how far Vicky was willing to go to harass me into submission. I had started mowing my lawn at 8:01 in the morning, exactly 1 minute after the designated start time that had been established by the HOA board, but Vicky claimed that her sophisticated noise monitoring equipment had detected what she called engine ignition preparation sounds at 7:58 in the morning, according to her completely twisted interpretation of the rules. Simply starting the mower engine constituted a noise violation regardless of when the actual mowing began or whether any neighbors were actually disturbed by the brief sound. Each violation came with professional quality photographs, precise timestamps, detailed noise level measurements, and enough official documentation to successfully prosecute a federal case in court. That's when Diane Peterson entered the picture like a guardian angel, appearing at my front door one evening with a warm casserole and what appeared to be a genuinely sympathetic smile. "I've been watching what Vicky's been systematically doing to you," she said with apparent concern, settling into my kitchen like we were old friends who had known each other for years. "The woman has completely lost her mind since her real estate empire collapsed in that big scandal a few years ago. She treats this HOA presidency like she's running a Fortune 500 company instead of managing a simple neighborhood association." Dan was attractive in that perfectly polished suburban way that suggested serious money and time for self-care, with expertly styled blonde hair and expensive athleisure where that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. "The trick with dealing with Vicky," Diane continued, confidentially picking at her perfectly manicured nails while choosing her words carefully, "is understanding that she operates entirely on power dynamics and psychological intimidation tactics. She's basically testing you right now, carefully measuring how much harassment and abuse you'll tolerate before you finally decide to fight back against her authority. If you play this situation smart and strategically, you can probably get her to back off without creating too much unnecessary drama for the entire community." Her advice seemed reasonable and well-informed, and frankly, I was genuinely grateful to finally have someone who seemed to understand the complex local dynamics and Vicky's Psychological patterns. Diane claimed to have lived in Willowbrook for 8 years and seemed to know everyone's personal history, including details about past conflicts and how they were resolved. My first official HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, and I approached it with what I genuinely believed was a diplomatic and reasonable mindset. I had spent hours preparing detailed talking points about reasonable accommodation policies for family medical emergencies and had drafted proposed amendments to make the community rules more practical and compassionate for working residents who might face unexpected life challenges. I genuinely believed that open communication, good faith discussion, and rational compromise could resolve our growing differences in a way that would benefit everyone involved. Looking back now with the benefit of hindsight, this might have been the most naive and foolish assumption I had ever made in my entire adult life. The meeting was held in the community center, a building that Vicky had somehow managed to transform into her own personal courtroom where she could hold proceedings like some kind of judicial authority. She positioned herself at the head of a long conference table like a Supreme Court judge presiding over a criminal trial, with other board members strategically flanked on either side to create an intimidating presence. About 40 residents filled the folding chairs that had been arranged in neat rows, and I noticed with growing concern that several people were actively avoiding eye contact with me, like I was carrying some kind of contagious disease. Vicky had clearly been very busy spreading her carefully crafted version of events during my 10-day absence, painting me as the villain in her narrative. Before we begin tonight's official agenda, Vicky announced in a voice that carried the practiced authority of someone who had grown accustomed to being obeyed without question, I think it's critically important that we address the ongoing and escalating compliance issues with one of our residents who seems to believe the rules don't apply to him. She opened an impressively thick binder with dramatic flair and began reading what she grandly called my comprehensive violation history, which consisted of 17 meticulously documented pages of alleged infractions spanning just 3 weeks each. Violation was read aloud with clinical precision and prosecutorial zeal, accompanied by exact timestamps, detailed photographic evidence, and elaborate analysis of how my supposedly criminal actions threatened the sacred community standards that everyone else managed to follow without difficulty. The public humiliation was methodical, thorough, and clearly designed to destroy my reputation in front of the entire community. By the time Vicky finished her lengthy and damning presentation, I felt like a serial offender rather than someone who had simply been caring for his critically ill mother during a family medical crisis. But here's where I made my first major tactical error, that not just around his house, but pointing at other people's houses. He claimed it was for security. I wasn't thrilled, but I didn't say anything until I noticed one pointed directly at my front door. That's when I pushed back, politely. I sent him an email asking if he could reposition it. He didn't reply. Instead, he doubled down and added 2 more cameras. One on a tree facing the street, and one across the sidewalk, angled suspiciously toward my driveway. I started to get uncomfortable. Not paranoid, just uneasy. I value privacy. I bought in a gated community to avoid stuff like this. So, I filed a complaint. The HOA board, basically Greg and his 2 golf buddies, dismissed it within 24 hours. He's within his rights, they said. Security is a priority. I let it go. What else could I do? But things escalated from there. Suddenly I was getting violation notices. My trash can was out 5 minutes early. My grass was half an inch too high. I had a seasonal wreath on my door that wasn't approved decor. It was ridiculous. Petty. Obvious harassment. Still, I played nice. Trimmed the lawn. Took down the wreath. I even apologized once, just to keep the peace. But peace wasn't what Greg wanted. He wanted control. Then came the delivery incident. It was a Saturday afternoon. My cousin was driving down to visit for the weekend. He's a contractor, so he drives a big work truck with his tools in the back. I gave him the gate code like I've done 100 times with family and friends. He punched it in, the gate opened, and he drove through. 5 minutes later, I get a knock at my door. It's Greg. He's standing there, arms crossed, eyes narrowed like he just caught me hiding state secrets. Behind him? My cousin's truck. Parked right in front of my house. You didn't get this vehicle approved, he snapped. I blinked. Approved? It's a guest. My cousin. We don't allow commercial vehicles without prior notice. That's in the bylaws. Now, here's the thing, the bylaws did mention something about long-term commercial parking. But not guests. Not someone visiting for the weekend. I told him that. Politely. Respectfully. I even offered to move the truck into my garage, though it probably wouldn't have fit. Greg didn't care. He threatened to fine me. Said he'd report it to the board. I told him to go ahead. I wasn't violating anything. That's when he snapped. He raised his voice. Said I was a threat to community standards. Said I was inviting crime by allowing unvetted individuals inside. I laughed. Not mockingly, just out of disbelief. That made him even angrier. He said if I didn't have the truck gone in 10 minutes, he'd call the police. I told him, be my guest. So, he did. And here's where the story takes a turn. The police arrived, sirens off, just cruising. I stood in the driveway with my cousin. Greg marched up to them like he was leading an army, arms waving, talking a mile a minute. The officer listened. Patiently. Then he turned to me. Sir, is that your cousin's vehicle? Yes, officer. And he came through the gate with your code? Correct. Any signs he's a threat or breaking the law? Not unless being a carpenter is a felony. The officer smiled. Then he turned back to Greg. You called us for this? Greg blinked. It's a violation. A security concern. The officer chuckled. You know we handle crimes, right? This guy's just visiting. Greg didn't like that. He argued. Loudly. Accused me of endangering the neighborhood. Said I had refused him entry when he came to inspect the situation. That's right, he tried to enter my property without my permission. And I told him no. The officer raised an eyebrow. You tried to go onto his property without being invited? I'm the HOA president. The cop burst out laughing. He wasn't alone. His partner, who had been quiet until then, actually leaned on the car door and said, Man, you're not the sheriff of Nottingham. Chill. Greg turned red. I mean tomato, fire hydrant, cherry pie red. He sputtered something about bylaws and community guidelines, but the cops were done. One of them told him unless there was an actual emergency, he shouldn't waste city resources. Then they told him to go home. That should have been the end. But it wasn't. 2 days later, I received a letter. A formal violation notice and a fine of $250 for non-compliance and refusal to cooperate with HOA leadership. I laughed when I read it, then I got mad. I decided I wasn't going to just roll over anymore. I wrote back. Politely, but firmly. I disputed the charge, outlined the events, and attached the names and badge numbers of the officers who had responded. I even requested a hearing. They denied it. So I went public. I printed flyers detailing everything that happened, word for word. No exaggeration, no name calling. Just the facts. Then I dropped one in every mailbox on the block. Turns out, I wasn't alone. My inbox blew up. Neighbors I barely knew came to thank me. Apparently, Greg had been on a power trip for years. People were afraid to speak out. But not anymore. A week later, a group of us gathered at the community center and requested a special meeting. We voted Greg out. Just like that. No yelling. No drama. Just a simple, clean, democratic process. And you know what? Peace returned. The cameras came down. The board was restructured. Guidelines were clarified. And my cousin? He still jokes that he's the criminal contractor who broke the HOA. I learned something through all this. Sometimes, standing your ground doesn't mean fighting. It just means refusing to be bullied. Refusing to let someone twist the rules to suit their ego. And the most powerful tool you have? Community. Because once people stand together, even the loudest tyrant can't shout them down. So the next time someone knocks on your door with a clipboard and a bad attitude, remember this, you have rights. You have a voice. And somewhere out there, a cop is still laughing about the day he had to explain to a self-important HOA president that president doesn't mean king. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-hungry HOA or nosy neighbor, share your story in the comments below. And if you're dealing with one right now, let this be a reminder, you're not alone. Stand your ground, stay respectful, and always, always know your rights. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who could use a little motivation to push back against unfair authority. Until next time, stay strong, and watch out for clipboards.